experience. Just a second. Okay. Also, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you folks. I see some familiar names and also faces for those who have their faces on the Zoom. It's nice to see everybody, and it's quite an honor to speak to you folks. I usually speak to undergrad and graduate students. I haven't been to the AAA since 2014. I miss most of all the book exhibits, although I always find them a bit depressing because there's so much of interest there, and there just isn't time to get to everything that one would like to. What I'm going to say is in great detail in my book, Yanomami in the Amazon toward a more ethical anthropology beyond othering. And it's in great detail. And that book I dared to publish with Kindle Direct publishing, self-publishing, for the simple reason that the royalties are up to 70%, much higher than any commercial or academic publisher. And all of the royalties are being donated to Survival International on behalf of their continuing vital work with the Yanomami. Other NGOs have helped, but I think there are in many ways foremost among those helping Yanomami. And also 2 other books I've published with Kindle for the same reason. I'm trying to accumulate some royalties and to donate them to Survival. I waited for 2 decades to publish this book. I was hoping that some objective, neutral scholar, historian, scientist, or whatever, would do a critical analysis of the controversy ignited by Patrick Tierney's book, Darkness in El Dorado. And after 2 decades, I finally decided I better do a book. I worked on it off and on for some years, but I finally decided, okay, I'll do it. Nobody else has. Although there's a lot of literature on this and controversy and also on the Yanomami. I tried my best to be neutral, fair, objective, scholarly, and so forth in this book in dealing with the controversy and other things. But I'm a human being, not perfect. And you can judge for yourself, including this talk. I think this book is important because the controversy itself has been filled with so much disinformation, confusion, misunderstanding, and so forth. Most of it in the media, but I'm sorry to say, shockingly, also in science and in academia. There were even people commenting on the book or even seeing it, let alone reading it, which is quite a marvelous feat. I wish I could learn how to do that. Regarding my engagement with Yanomami, as was mentioned, I did field research in 1974 to 75 in Venezuela for part of my Cornell University dissertation, part of it. And that dissertation was titled The Hunter and the Hunter in the Amazon, an integrated biological and cultural approach to human predation. Since 1979, I've published on the Yanomami, a lot of it dealing with their situation in terms of various crises, including the invasions by wildcat gold miners. And I organized 2 sessions at the AAA on the Yanomami in 2002 and 2014. And then I organized other sessions from 1987 to 2014 on things like ethics and on human rights. And I've been following the literature on the Yanomami in particular since I haven't been able to go back for various reasons, partly because I married a Thai philosopher and I've been traveling to Thailand and doing research there during the summers until COVID started. So I followed the literature as closely as possible since that time, 1974. Although I have very broad and diverse interests, it's one of my weaknesses, Achilles' heel. I'm not narrowly specialized. And I have other interests and obligations. Yanomami in the Amazon, in Brazil, in Venezuela, one of the most famous, fascinating, studied, misrepresented, exploited, and endangered indigenous peoples in the world. I think that's an accurate statement. I'm going to talk about each of those as we have time. And first of all, famous. I looked in the Handbook of South American Indians, published in 1946, 7 volumes, with Julian Stewart as the editor, in the index for Yanomami and Yanomamo, and they do not appear in the index. There are some regional names like Shirishana and so forth in the index, but Yanomami and Yanomamu do not appear. In the United States, undoubtedly, the ethnographic case study Yanomamu, the Fierce People by Napoleon Chagnon, really put the Yanomami on the map. They became ethnographic celebrities of sorts in anthropology and beyond. Also, the documentary films, depending on the source, 20 to 40 of them that were made in collaboration with Timothy Hatch. They're widely used, of course, in teaching and to this day as well. And the films in particular, the axe fight and the feast, seem most attractive. Incidentally, it's rather curious. Yanomamu with an O at the end is the spelling used by Chagnon and his associates. Most anthropologists who have firsthand experience with the Yanomami use I at the end. That's the distinction. It's almost like a red flag, you know where they're coming from. In 2010, there was the documentary Secrets of the Tribe. And in that, Chagnon estimates that 3 to 4 million students have read his ethnography. And it's gone through 6 editions from 1968 to 2012. The 6th edition has a very interesting interview with Chagnon by his colleague and long-term friend, Bill Irons. Chagnon's book has actually been translated into 4 languages: Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, and even Turkish, which is curious. As Chagnon says in another film, which is the special event Edge series, it's available online, and it's titled Blood is Their Argument. Blood is Their Argument, in which he's interviewed and converses with Steven Pinker, Richard Wrangham, and a number of others. Very interesting and useful to get his perspective on the Yanomami and the controversy. The Yanomami were also publicized by Jacques Liesel in France and in Venezuela, Elcida Rita Ramos in Brazil, And more recently, 2013, a Yanomami, Davy Kopenawa, co-authored a book with Bruce Albert, a French anthropologist, and it's titled "The Falling Sky, the Words of a Yanomami Shaman." And there's a whole chapter on his apprenticeship as a shaman, which is really unique, very informative, insightful. And he's traveled extensively internationally as a spokesperson on behalf of Yanomami. And I'll say a little bit about that later if I have time. So he also has in that book some commentary on those experiences in other cultures, observations about them. It's a very interesting book. The Yanomami documentary, Secrets of the Tribe, in 2010 was aired on BBC, HBO, Sundance Film Festival, and other venues. Unfortunately, it's an embarrassment, public image of our discipline. Kenneth Good in 1991 wrote Into the Heart, and it got a lot of media coverage, and so did the Yanomami. And his oldest son, David, the first Yanomami American, has also got a lot of publicity. You can search Google and YouTube and find quite a bit about them. Elsewhere, anthropologists have brought the Yanomami to the attention of the profession, the public, as I've mentioned. And I'll say a little more about that later. Fascinating. The Yanomami are a radically different society, culture, and occasionally generate culture shock for some people. They have a unique way of relating to each other, to nature, and the supernatural. Two very different lines of evidence. Blood group genetics and linguistics converge on the same conclusion. The Yanomami have been an independent society for 2,000 years. 2,000 years. The countries that they now live in, although many of them don't recognize that, Brazil and Venezuela, have a history as nations going back 200 years. The Yanomami, 2,000. So the nations of Brazil and Venezuela are recent experiments. And tragically, sadly, it appears that the experiment in Venezuela is failing, a failed state. The Yanomami are remarkable in just how well they live with so little in the way of material culture. They can put everything they own individually on their back and walk out of the village in 5 minutes. I don't know how many of you could put everything you own on your back and walk out of your home. They are, in many ways, what Marshall Solins called the original affluent society. Their needs are limited. They're fairly easily satisfied, easily in quotes, and their desires are very limited. There is no greed as such until they begin to be impacted by the outside. Incidentally, I forgot to mention their language is also considered independent language. It hasn't been found to be related to any other languages in South America. Although their material culture is very limited, it looks simple, but actually it ain't so simple. It's very complex. It takes a lot of skill to make and to use, for example, the bow and arrow. I tried back in 74, 75 to go hunting with Yanomami as much as possible. to observe their behavior and ecology. I was younger then, but it was quite a challenge to go up and down the hills and mountainsides, slippery, wet paths, and so forth.
I'm going to
And
exercise.
in retrospect, I was very naive and risky. One colleague once asked me, why didn't you go to a nice place like the Caribbean where there aren't any poisonous snakes, et cetera, et cetera? I hadn't thought of that kind of thing at the time. But I survived. I didn't get sick. And I found the Yanomami to be courteous, hospitable, very kind and considerate, very helpful, etc. Um, I really cherish that experience with them, and it is, as many of you in your field experience, embedded in your memory. So although the material culture is very limited, try to make and use a bow and arrow. If you're not Yanomami, that's impossible. And I was awed by observing them in the forest. They read the forest like a book. And I could go into more detail on that if there were time. The pivotal ethic central to Yanomami culture is reciprocity in both positive and negative ways, we would say. For example, a hunter cannot consume the prey that he kills. Some family members can, but it is distributed to other hunters. So this enforces reciprocity through food sharing. Traditionally, the Yanomami interact intimately, socially, and ecologically. They live in a large communal house traditionally, round shelter with an open central area, and number from a few dozen to a few hundred. Very intimate, close social relationships. Yanomami don't know strangers traditionally. We would see more strangers just walking in the park or down the city street than most Yanomami would see in an entire lifetime. They're humorous. This has largely been missed. But 3 independent observers in print have commented on the frequency of laughter being extraordinary compared to other societies.
Later on today, I'll probably read it with my wife because she's interested in stuff like this.
And I assume that if someone were fluent in the Yanomami language, an entire book or dissertation could be researched on Yanomami humor, which would really be fascinating and significant. My dissertation aimed to document the Yanomami hunter as a biological, cultural, and intellectual being, far too ambitious, which should have been obvious, and my committee actually warned me against that. I had 3 anthropologists and 2 biologists on my committee, but I missed another being, spiritual being. For the Yanomami, the forest is filled with spiritual beings and forces. They are animus in a positive way. And I missed that because I was so narrowly focused. I was looking at them as a biologist might wolves or lions or other mammalian predators. I was using the same framework, paradigm that zoologists use in studying major predators, key species, and ecosystems. Now, turning to studied, Yanomami are among the most studied indigenous peoples in the world. Believe it or not, over 100 different anthropologists have actually had the privilege of living and studying with the Yanomami. And in my dissertation, there's an appendix which lists as many as I could find, and I'm sure I missed a few. Also, about a dozen missionaries have lived with the Yanomami in their missions, and several of them have written books about it, including missionaries, children who were born in the forest and married a Yanomami, and they grew up bicultural and bilingual. And it's a fascinating literature. And again, I think there's enough material that an anthropologist or somebody else could write an entire book based on looking at that literature. So there's so much available on the Yanomami that one could, and I don't know of anybody that has done this yet, compare the ethnographies and find points of agreement, which presumably are cultural reality. Yes, cultural reality exists, whatever postmodernists say, the extreme ones, and points of disagreement, which would reflect particular circumstances, individuals, their personalities, their interests, and so forth. And I hope I live to see this, but I would love to see a Yanomami trained as an anthropologist critically analyze the literature that has been written about his or her culture. I think that would be quite amazing. Beth Conklin, in The American Anthropologist in 2013, reviewed Chagnon's memoir, Noble Savages, which is subtitled something like Two Dangerous Tribes, the Yanomami and Yanomamu he uses, and the anthropologists. I didn't know that anthropologists were a dangerous tribe. But anyway, she reviewed, and this is what she had to write, among other things, about that memoir. The most thoroughly scrutinized scholarship in anthropological history has focused on the Yanomami. Over the past half century that numerous scholars have studied them, developments among the Yanomami and developments in anthropological theory have co-evolved. Yanomami case studies figured in almost every theoretical debate in the 1970s to the 1990s, from sociobiology to cultural materialism to reflective critique of politics of representation, unquote. I teach a graduate seminar this semester on the history and theory of anthropology. And I welcomed the opportunity. The faculty member who usually teaches it is on sabbatical the full year, and it's a required course, and it needed to be taught. And no other faculty, regular faculty, wanted to take it on. And I have a long-term interest in that. And I thought it would help me reflect on Yanomami studies as a microcosm of anthropology. And what I found are a number of recurrent themes, and among them are dualisms or oppositions, often characterized as that: biology or culture, nature or nurture, subjectivity, objectivity, essentialism, constructionism, and basic and applied research in anthropology, and so forth. And I think in the history and theory of anthropology, often individuals have taken one side or the other. Occasionally, not too frequently, some individuals have tried to find a middle ground or integrate or even reconcile two of these. I think, for example, Roy Rappaport's book, Pigs for the Ancestors, has both Edic and Emic components in it. And so this also applies to Yanomami studies. These dualisms, which are often seen as oppositions. 7 more or less successive phases have transpired in Yanomami research. and elements of these continue right up to the present. Exploratory ethnography, salvage ethnography, anthropology of war, applied anthropology, advocacy and human rights, indigenous anthropology, and so on. If time were available, I could cite books as examples on the main theories in anthropology and the main methods that have been done with Yanomami. So this can be seen as a microcosm of anthropology. Indeed, the Yanomami are even relevant to the most recent discussion and debate about Sherry Ortner's dark anthropology and Joel Robbins, which he calls the anthropology of good, although I prefer to refer to it as light anthropology. Dark anthropology focuses on phenomena that cause human suffering, harsh, brutal, dehumanizing dimensions of social life. Violence, inequality, power struggles, domination, exploitation, insecurity, and so forth. In contrast, light anthropology focuses on phenomena like empathy, compassion, kindness, caring, cooperation, sharing, happiness, and well-being. And even in the current wars in the world, there's also peace. There are also people that are nonviolent. There are medical doctors trying to save lives and reduce harm and so forth and so on. So it's not a total thing, war. And the same thing with human nature, the same thing with human society. But often the focus is on the dark side. And so this has become something, I think, merging on a paradigm shift, not only in anthropology, but in primatology and in animal studies, ethology. For example, Brian Hare and his wife, Nessa Woods, who were anthropology husband-wife team at Duke University, have studied dog behavior and have studied bonobos in Africa. And they wrote a book called Survival of the Friendliest. This was in 2020. They argue that the friendliest are more likely to survive and reproduce, perpetuating their genes, reproductive fitness, than the belligerent. This is the opposite of the article by Chagnon in 1988 in Science magazine, in which he argues and has data to try to support that Yanomami males who kill more have more wives and more children, and therefore more reproductive fitness. So another perspective is available. Chagnon neglected half of the population among the Yanomami, including when he labeled them the fierce people. The other half, women, as if women don't have any agency. They don't have any role in mate choice, in reproductive fitness. And in particular, what about childcare? And that aspect of Yanomami culture has been grossly neglected, the role of women, even by about a half a dozen female anthropologists who apparently have also been somewhat gender biased, male-wise, by their education. And I don't know of any ethnography, and I hope somebody might correct me here, that really focuses very closely and continuously on the role of women in Yanomami culture. The Yanomami have been incorporated in the human nature industry. supported by the assertion that they have chronic endemic tribal warfare, bolstering Hobbesian or neo-Hobbesian pseudoscience and bias. People like Stephen Pinker, Richard Wrangham, and so on. And I have a whole appendix in my book about the human nature industry and how the Yanomami have been used to help bolster that. They're often cited in relation to that. But as I suggested in the book, Survival of the Fittest, Survival of the Friendliest, there's another side of human nature, which is often grossly neglected. The Yanomami are not primitives. They're not Hobbesian savages. They do not have chronic warfare. Indeed, in my opinion, they don't even have warfare. They don't even have warfare. I teach a course on aggression, war, and peace, anthropology of that. And I'm also familiar somewhat with the literature from historians, political scientists, psychologists, and others. And definitions that are commonly used about warfare are often far too broad and inclusive. I want to read to you a statement by 19 anthropologists who have had the privilege of living and studying with the Yanomami. 19. Some many years longer than Chagnon's field work. It was posted on the website of Survival International in February 26, 2013, and you can still find it there. And if you'll bear with me, quote, "We, the undersigned, have all worked with the Yanomami Indians for prolonged periods at different times during the last 5 decades. We have closely witnessed them to be generally peaceable people who, as many traditional peoples do, occasionally engage in inter-village conflicts, ritualized raids, and duels. Yet the casualties of these culturally controlled conflicts are extremely low if compared with those of the violence and contamination inflicted on the Yanomami by gold miners and cattle ranchers who invade their lands. We absolutely disagree with Napoleon Chagnon's public characterization of the Yanomami as fierce, violent, and archaic people. We also deplore how Chagnon's work has been used throughout the years and could still be used by governments to deny the Yanomami their land and cultural rights," unquote. These are 19 anthropologists who signed this. I don't know of any case in the history of anthropology like this. This is unprecedented, unique. Leda Martins, in a book called Yanomami, The Fierce Controversy and What We Can Learn from It, masterfully edited by Robert Borowski, she makes the case and documents that Chagnon's characterization of the Yanomami was picked up in the Brazilian media and in turn by government officials and others, and actually used against the Yanomami in terms of trying to go against their land rights, so on. And that book, incidentally, I think is the best book on the controversy, Darkness in El Dorado. Borowski expertly, very skillfully couched 3 roundtables among 6 anthropologists, 3 critical of Chagnon, 3 defending Chagnon, and he couched that between an introduction and a conclusion, and it is framed for students, although it's very detailed and a bit complicated. But I think that's the best book, and it nicely complements mine as well, which deals with somewhat different things. Since the 1950s, the terms primitive and savage have been recognized as derogatory stereotypes and inappropriate for professional anthropologists to use. although some book titles still had primitive or savage in their titles into the 60s at least. The first textbook I ever used to teach cultural anthropology was Melville Hershkovitz, his 1955 book, although I started teaching in around 69, 70 alone after I was a TA. And in that book, Cultural Anthropology, Chapter 19, Cultural Relativism and Cultural Values, Hershkovitz writes, primitive is an evaluative term rather than a descriptive one, and characteristics associated with the term are questionable. Those called primitive or savages are very diverse and cannot be stereotyped. It is questionable whether any single criterion is sufficient to describe the diverse cultures that are considered non-literate. There is no justification for regarding any living group as our contemporary ancestor. This is in a textbook, 1955. Nevertheless, in 2013, in his memoir, which I would recommend reading if you haven't, it's very insightful, very informative. Chagnon's perspective on all of this, very important. In that memoir, Chagnon variously characterizes Yanomami, and repeatedly so, as pristine, wild Indians, primitive, primordial, Stone Age, Neolithic, and Paleolithic. That's quite an achievement for a society to be both Paleolithic and Neolithic. Furthermore, and again, a bit of a lengthy quote, please bear with me. This is an admonition by David Mayberry Lewis of Harvard University and one of the founders of cultural survival, quote, ways in which we anthropologists portray the societies they study have consequences, sometimes serious, in the real world. Indigenous societies have all too often been maligned in the past, denigrated as savages, and marginalized at the edges of modern world. It is not therefore a trivial matter to insist on the fierceness of a people or to maintain that they represent an especially primitive stage of human evolution. Chagnon has not done this inadvertently to the Yanomami. On the contrary, he has done so deliberately, systematically, and over a long period of time, in spite of the remonstrances of fellow anthropologists. We at Cultural Survival consider this to be not only bad science, but also a bad example of harmful writing about an indigenous people, unquote. This is a very strong statement by a very prominent, very important anthropologist. This achieved a lot academically in terms of applied and advocacy work. The Yanomami cannot realistically be characterized as pristine, even decades ago. For example, there are Yanomami trained as bilingual bicultural teachers in some villages, as in simplified tropical medicine, who use a microscope to look at blood samples to diagnose malaria strains, give inoculations, give medications, and so forth and so on. In 1972, already 1972, two Yanomami traveled to Rome, Italy, to visit Pope Paul VI, together with Luis Coco, the Salesian Catholic missionary who worked for 14 years with Yanomami. Avi Kopanawa, I mentioned previously, has traveled internationally. He's spoken to the British House of Parliament, to the United Nations, and elsewhere. He's been interviewed on National Public Radio in the US and so forth and so on. And besides that, all of that, There is Hoseka Yanomami, who's an artist, and a book has been published with his many paintings on Yanomami and with text by Bruce Albert and others. And the book is called Our Forest Land, Our Forest Land. Also, there are Yanomami NGOs fighting for human rights, civil rights, etc., territorial integrity. Hutucara in Brazil started in 2004. Coronami in Venezuela started in 2011. And there are laptop computers in some Yanomami schools, thanks to a project of cultural survival. So there are Yanomami who are using laptop computers and even the internet and emails. They're in cyberspace age, not Stone Age, at least some. Brian Ferguson wrote a book called Yanomami Warfare, A Political History in 1995. It's masterful. It's a thorough, meticulous screening of the ethno-historical and ethnographic literature, and he makes the case that the Yanomami have had indirect contact with the outside world for centuries and direct contact for decades at least along the periphery of their territory. And so they are not some untouched, static culture by any means. Cultures are dynamic, and so are the Yanomami, responding to internal and external forces. They're not a stage of prehistoric cultural evolution. Now, Chagnon refers to Waitiri, a Yanomami word, as fierce. Bruce Albert, who has worked with Yanomami for decades and co-authored that book with Davy Kopenawa and so on, he says, quote, "The term Waitiri is quite ambivalent as it can affirm a quality, valor, courage, endurance, or denounce a rejected behavior, aggressive, violent, depending on the context." A missionary converted to anthropology, linguistic anthropologist Ernest Migliasa, spent many years among the Yanomami in Brazil and says, quote, "The term Waitiri has a semantic range from brave, courageous, daring, fearless, to savage, furious, and aggressive. Fierce, depending mainly on the context." So a number of anthropologists and others could be cited, Alcida Ramos, Jacques Liso, and Evelyn Montgomery, are saying similar things. The word Waitiri has a wide semantic range and cannot be exclusively glossed as fierce. And incidentally, Yanomami, the fierce people, are Yanomami women fierce? Or Yanomami children fierce? And there are Yanomami males who do not engage in aggressive behavior, do not go on raids. Even the filmmaker Timothy Atch, who collaborated with Chagnon, and of course he made many films beyond the Yanomami case, and there are whole books about him as a visual anthropologist. He became very critical and, quote, "The fierce people, indeed, you can't call an entire society the fierce people, or any one thing for that matter. You could say, however, that Chagnon is the fierce person," unquote. And another quote, "Irresponsibly categorized and grossly maligned fierce people," unquote. Incidentally, I think part of the reason for this characterization of the Yanomami is related to Chagnon's, in quotes, rapport in some villages. In 3 publications, he admits having weaponry in the field, such as a British commando knife, electric stun gun, and chemical mace hands. I don't know how many of you in your field research had to be armed with weaponry for protection against your informants. That never ever crossed my mind in the communities where I was, at least. Maybe if I had been in the area where Chagnon was, maybe I'd have a different impression. Kenneth Good, who lived with the Yanomami for about a dozen years, says, quote, in his book, Into the Heart, 1991, to my great surprise, I had found among them a way of life that, while dangerous and harsh, was also filled with camaraderie, compassion, and 1,000 daily lives in communal harmony. The more I thought about Chagnon's emphasis on Yanomami violence, the more I realized how contrived and distorted it was. Raiding, killing, wife beating all happened. I was seeing it, and I would see more, undoubtedly. But by misrepresenting violence as the central theme in Yanomami life, his Fierce People book had blown the subject out of any sane proportion, unquote. And Good in his book says the Yanomami men are not macho. They limit, not maximize violence. They lack open warfare. Quote, the Yanomami I knew never engage in anything like open warfare. They think it is absurd to risk your life that way and possibly get a lot of people killed. Instead, a raiding party will sneak up on an enemy village and hide in the bushes overnight, maybe on the trail leading to the village gardens. Then next morning, they will wait until someone passes, shoot him, and then run off. No heroics, no single combat, no massed battles, just hide, shoot, and run. You accomplish your purpose and you don't get yourself killed in the process. Now, typically, anthropologists in much of the literature and sometimes beyond anthropology define war very, very broadly and inclusively as basically armed, lethal, intergroup aggression. If you use that definition, then one might try to argue that the Yanomami have warfare. And in particular, if you consider raids cumulatively, collectively, over many, many years as being amounting to warfare. But in my opinion, the Yanomami do not have anything like warfare. And you can consider the famous film Dead Birds, the ethnography about them and so forth in comparison, or other so-called tribal warfare, in comparison to what the Yanomami have in the way of intergroup aggression and intra-group aggression on occasion. The term is so broadly defined, so encompassing, such diverse varieties as to be meaningless, in my opinion, except to attract attention, prestige, and in some cases sell books for royalties. Applying the word war to Yanomami, in my view, dulls the critical senses. Actually, the Yanomami do not have the capacity for any regular warfare. They have no food surplus that could sustain regular, persistent warfare over a long period of time. In the wet season, I've been there in the wet season, travel is very difficult, as are slippery snakes are concentrated in the high ground areas. It's very treacherous. Wet season simply would discourage even just raiding that I've described. And the Yanomami have mechanisms for conflict, nonviolent conflict resolution, avoidance of conflict, restraining conflict, and so forth, although these haven't been very well documented. Instead of war, traditional Yanomami aggression, as we know it from the ethnographic literature, not only Chagnon, is reminiscent of the famous blood feud between the Hatfield and McCoy families that killed 12 in a cycle of murders and raids from 1882 to 1890 in the mountains between Kentucky and Virginia. That's comparable, in my view. And in that case, there was exaggerating, in quotes, yellow journalism, unquote, focusing on selective fragments of reality and creating a myth of savagery. Exploited, and I'm going to have to probably end here because I'm getting over time. There's actually something of a Yanomami industry. Industry in the sense of a distinctive group of productive enterprises, many profiting without any benefit for Yanomami. Of course, academic theses and dissertations and publications might be considered exploitative if they do not reciprocate in genuine ways, not just tokenism, to the Yanomami. By now, there are over 100 books about the Yanomami. I have 3 shelves of books on the Yanomami, and I don't have them all. I haven't read all of the literature. Again, I have diverse interests and obligations. Only 3 books, as far as I know, contribute royalties to humanitarian NGOs to help the Yanomami. Besides my own, the one by Robert Borofsky and the one by John Peters, a missionary for many years with Yanomami who converted to anthropology and wrote a 1998 book, which is very good, on Yanomami. You look at Amazon.com or eBay, there are Yanomami photos, films, sound recordings of shamanic rituals, musical compositions, MP3 music performances, tour companies, including one in Moscow, calendars, postcards, T-shirts, baby bibs and bodysuits, and prefabricated essays for students to cheat in their classes, writing an essay about the Yanomami. Of course, now we have AI, which might make that less expensive. In a search on eBay in October 8th of this year, I found with the word Yanomami 292 items, mostly baskets and books, but also artist Katerina Bohak advertised on eBay a painting she made of a Yanomami woman, which sold for only $2,550. We talk about cultural appropriation. Another example of cultural appropriation is the book, and the Yanomami industry is the book by Larry Barron, The Last Warriors Face to Face with the Yanomami, describing 6 whole days that he spent with the Yanomami collecting artifacts to later sell for profit. He describes them as primitive, fierce, dangerous, aggressive, demonic, devilish, and unpredictable. The only source he cites in the literature is Chagnon's book. Now, it seems like Chagnon probably became a millionaire through 6 editions of his ethnography, 4 translations, 3 other books, including his memoir, and the numerous films. 1988, he established the Yanomami Survival Fund and in several venues requested donations. Linda Rabin, in her book, Brazil, Indians and the Onslaught of Civilization, in a footnote, reports examining the publicly available tax records for the Yanomami Survival Fund. There was no evidence of any activity. And it was eventually the fund was dissolved after 27 years. Normally, NGOs like Cultural Survival, Survival International, etc., publish reports, newsletters, maintain websites, etc., not Chagnon's NGO. Finally, and I'll have to stop here, the best concise overview of professional ethics and anthropology I found, and I teach a course on ethics and anthropology, is by Myron Perez Glaser in the Encyclopedia of Cultural Anthropology, edited by David Levinson and Melvin Ember, 1996. And Glaser poses 4 penetrating questions. Are researchers invariably exploiting the people they study? If so, how can this be minimized? Do the subjects benefit from the research in any ways that they themselves consider meaningful and fair? Third, does the researcher adequately respect the integrity of the subject's culture, avoid undue interference, and minimize disturbance? And finally, how are anthropologists held accountable for their behavior, research, and publication? You can begin to answer those questions with the Yanomami cases, various literature on them, and also with the film Secrets of the Tribe. In the book, The Ethics of Anthropology, Debates and Dilemmas, edited by Pat Kaplan, quote, in the preface, yet the ethics of anthropology is clearly not just about obeying a set of guidelines. It actually goes to the heart of the discipline, the premises on which its practitioners operate, its epistemology, theory, praxis. In other words, what is anthropology for? Who is it for? And I was going to talk about the controversy, but probably have already gotten into it enough, and I am running behind, I think, on time. So I'll have to leave that go. You can read about it in several chapters in my book and, of course, elsewhere. And I will just mention that the controversy which exploded over Tierney's book in 2000 is not extinct, not dead. In 2020, Gavin Weston and Nathalie Johari wrote a book called Anthropological Controversies, which has a whole chapter on darkness in El Dorado. And I regret that the controversy and 10 others surrounding Chagnon since 1976 have often distracted attention from the situation of the Yanomami, which has involved a road encroaching on their territory in Brazil in 1970s and in 1980s, and again since 2019, invasions of thousands of illegal gold miners. And finally, there is a wealth of material on all sides of the controversy, fairly neutral, objective, on a website archive of Douglas Hume, Hume, and it has a wealth of material. Again, a whole book or dissertation could be written, researched, just using that archive. Oh, I'd better stop. I was going to talk about the Yanomami as an endangered society, but I mentioned that in the article that just came out in late September in a place available online, which Tim kindly mentioned to you, E-International Relations. And I don't talk about Chagnon in that. I talk only about the Yanomami. And in that, I say a lot about Jair Bolsonaro, who was a disaster as president of Brazil for Yanomami and other indigenous populations. And I mentioned Lula, who is the new president since 2021. And there's some hope for a better future for the Yanomami. And the Yanomami still are a large population. And as indigenous populations, we know historically often rebound and increase, and sometimes have revitalizations, movements culturally and otherwise. I hope dearly that this will happen with the Yanomami. So I better stop. Thank you so much for your forbearance with my quotes and my throat. I do have a problem with my throat, unfortunately. Not nerves. I don't get nervous anymore. But I look forward to whatever discussion there is, whether there are questions, rebuttals, criticisms, etc. Thank you so very much to all of you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, thank you very, very much, Les, and fascinating, really fascinating, and just a wealth of information, knowledge about the Yanomami, the books that have been written, the perspectives, the theories, controversies, etc. I've been very enlightened by it. And so at this point, I'd like to turn over to the audience or the people that are here, other ASA members and others. If you have any questions for Les, he's very willing to take questions or entertain your comments. So go ahead. Anybody? Yes, Rick?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Les, for a really enlightening talk. I really appreciated the vast perspective that you shared with us on the Yanomami. My question is this. As I understand it, the Yanomami are a very large group covering a tremendous area. I imagine that among the Yanomami, there are many regional differences. And I wonder if it's possible that the difference between your perspective and Chagnon's perspective is a matter of the Yanomami just really being different in different areas of their territory. If that's not the case, how do you account for Chagnon's gross misrepresentation of the Yanomami? Was he purposely misrepresenting them to build his own reputation and make money, make himself famous and so on? Or was he looking through a lens that had been shaped by his personality or his previous experiences so that he would just notice certain things and not others?
I think there may be some of that, but on the other hand, Liesel and Ken Good, Jacques Liesel, the French anthropologist, and Ken Good, both worked in the same general area. And they differ markedly from Chagnon's view. And remember that statement by 19 anthropologists. Carl Hyder in The American Anthropologist has an article on the Rashomon effect, which is really a classic, and I think would help explain some of this. There are individual differences among anthropologists in terms of the focus they have, their personalities, their politics, their ideology, the questions they ask, the issues they address, etc. But there is also male bias. And that's not just Chagnon. I mean, in a sense, my own dissertation was male bias. I was looking at hunters. That was my focus as a biological anthropologist. I admit it. We all have biases, unconscious, implicit, whatever, various types of biases. So I think some of it is just Chagnon's personal bias. And I don't condemn him. I don't dismiss him 100%. I think he has made some contributions to anthropology and in particular to sociobiology and particularly to discussions of human nature. I don't agree. I find fault, problematic things there, but read his memoir and look at The Edge. Blood is their argument video in which there are conversations with him, and also the film Secrets of the Tribe. You can get his perspective, and I think that's very, very important. I asked the filmmaker on more than one occasion, he has footage of not just Chagnon and the others in the film, 300 hours, 300 hours of raw footage. He interviewed me for about an hour or more, and he only has three brief, very brief, a couple of sentences here and there on what I had to say in the interview. So he had to be very selective. I asked him if he would consider contributing the raw footage to the anthropology archives at the Smithsonian. And he said, well, that's very problematic, getting permission, et cetera, et cetera. I also approached people at the Smithsonian to try to get that footage. I think it's very, very important documentation for the history of anthropology. And again, that 300 hours of footage could be the subject of a book or a dissertation. So anyway, I think the answer is really mixed. And I don't dislike Chagnon at all. I very much feel sorry for him, what he went through. Although I also feel sorry for what other people went through, and especially the Yanomami. But I do dislike some of the things he did and wrote about Yanomami. And there's a lot of documentation about this. And Marshall Solins, I didn't take time to quote it, but he said in the Washington Post in a review of Tierney's book, a lot of this was already known long before Tierney published in 2000. And the best evidence of that, I'm paraphrasing Marshall Solins, can be found in Chagnon's own writings. And I gave you the example of weaponry that he had in the field. Plus, he admits in several publications that, he was invited by Yanomami raiders to take them in his motorized canoe to go to a raid, and it would save them a lot of time and effort walking through the forest. And he agreed, and he did so. He mentions this 3 times. I ask you, what are the implications of that if somebody were killed? It's a serious matter, and it's in his own writings, and you can find other things as well. So this is all a very complex, very difficult, very ugly at times, a lot of negativity. Incidentally, also some positivity, which I didn't get to, and that is since 2000, you look at the years published for books on ethics and anthropology, and there's been exponential growth. The AAA, since 2000, has had more and more sessions on ethics. I don't know whether that wave is still continuing. I haven't checked. And so there's a lot of attention to professional ethics. And for all the negativity and the bad things that have happened, ugly things in this controversy, there have been some positives. And that actually is why I got involved in the first place. And I get involved again because I thought this could increase the awareness, sensitivity, and responsibility of anthropologists, professional ethics. And that could help people like the Yanomami. I'm talking too much.
Thanks, Les. Okay, Dennis Weidman, do you have a comment?
Well, so good to be here again at our monthly chats. And Leslie, it's so fine to have you review and detail all of this anthropological material on the Yanomami. It's impressive the vastness of the details, and also to learn about so many of the publications and the controversies. So you've really done an honorable job in doing this, and
Thank you.
so your work is honored, and your book, will be welcomed, I believe. But I was trained in cultural ecology in the 70s, and so a lot of the foundation of what you were talking about and your own career, is in the cultural ecology realm. But what I picked up from your review, where you were trying to characterize the way anthropologists have the theories, the major theories over time, and the binary oppositions that you had a whole list of them. The things that anthropologists, the theories are in oppositional, and so what I pick up from this, and also of your comments to Rick just now, is this Claude Lévi-Strauss, his theories of binary oppositions. I taught, I'm retired now, but I taught anthropology theory for decades. And I would teach that anthropology, we have these major theories, and I would try to objectively present each one. But I would then say, well, these are in binary opposition with one another. And that anthropologists, if we're proposing theories to explain human behavior at the universal level, then the theories that we're proposing, we as anthropologists, as a community, we're governed and we're within those same forces which can explain our own behaviors, as alluded to. Anthropology is a tribe, right? And so that's how I taught anthro theory for decades. And so what I see here is that the binary opposition, Lévi-Strauss, not only in ideas that we have, but our social organizations, material culture, have these oppositions. And that and when it comes to your talk, the ideas that we configure as anthropologists, these themes can be characterized as the various theories set in opposition to the other theories. So this oppositional dialogue, which Lévi-Strauss predicted, it's governing our own theory development and the way we interact. And so with your latest discourse there with Rick, I could say, well, I was going to say this to begin with, that this binary is what anthropologists are doing, and we're just human. But also, isn't your part of the binary opposition is it clarifies certain keywords and phrases which are in opposition to the other paradigm. So your book is actually a binary opposition to Dragnons. And what it does is it helps clarify it, helps so it's more understandable to the readers. But once again, we're just living this universal theory that a binary opposition.
Yeah. And as academics and scientists, I regret that he isn't available to dialogue with, and that his allies would probably not be amenable to a civil dialogue on all of this, even 20 years later. I think it would be very difficult. We need to somehow surmount those binary oppositions if we want to really progress more. in our science and in our scholarship.
Yeah. Thank you. That's what I had to say, and thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jack?
Yes, thank you. Just a very brief question. Beyond the ethical questions surrounding Shagnon's work among the Yanomami, I'm wondering if there should be a consideration of ethical matters regarding his critics and the
Yes,
criticisms.
yes. I agree. And you know, I co-authored. I was the second author on a memo sent to the AAA, which was leaked. It was supposed to be confidential, and to simply summarize Tierney's book and alert the AAA to an impending public relations challenge. And Terry Turner was drafted the memo, and my name was on it. And I regret some of the wording in that memo. It was written in the heat of the moment. We weren't surprised by Tierney's book, but we were shocked at the amount of allegations. Almost every page, there's such numerous and diverse allegations there. And so in regarding the memo, I would say it wasn't the most ethical the way it was written. And yet, under the same circumstances, I wouldn't hesitate at all to alert the AAA. I would just try to take more precautions to keep it confidential. But at any rate, you or others may find fault with me ethically in other respects, this controversy or other things, even apart from the Yanomami. But as far as my conscience is, it's clear, other than that memo, and I mentioned this in my book as well. I have a whole appendix number 2 on my involvement in the controversy. And I would say there are others who have been far, far more unethical in dealing with the controversy than I. But I don't claim to be perfect. I'm a human being.
Okay, thank you. Maria, do you have a question or a comment?
Well, I just wanted to say that the Association of Senior Anthropologists has a session in Toronto. I believe it's on Saturday, and Stephen Schenzel is one of the organizers on ethics and for anthropologists. So if you're in Toronto and interested in that question,
Yeah.
come to it.
I'm gonna be on that in that session, and it's actually on Thursday. But
Oh, it's
Great.
Thursday. Thank you. Thank you.
I hope they'll follow up with a publication.
Okay, thank you. Herb, do you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, this sort of goes back to the the last one about the memo, because in the Terence Turner and Leslie Sponsel memo that you mentioned, you particularly accused James Neal and Shagnon of very, very serious malfeasance, even causing illness and death, even perhaps purposefully. And it was in Tierney's, at least I think in the New Yorker article, he may have pulled back. And you didn't mention that at all. And I have here a book that you also didn't mention that I just happened to just find on my shelf the other day, Lost Paradises and the Ethics of Research and Publication by Salzano and Hurtado, with a number of writers. And one of the things that they claim is that this is really set back. That is the fear and the idea of these kinds of medical malfeasance has set back programs for medical health. And I would just to add one more thing, from Michael Brown's review of the Borofsky volume. At present, as Borofsky observes, the dispute has not benefited the Yanomami one bit, and they essentially live under the same tenuous health conditions as before. Salzano and Hurtado are suggesting that they're even worse, perhaps, as a result. Would you like to say anything about that?
Yeah, on that last point, I would differ. And I think the dispute has raised ethical consciousness and responsibility. And on the first point, as I understand it, and I'm open to criticism, we were summarizing Tierney's book. We were not making allegations ourselves. But that maybe is open to interpretation. I, in my book, do not deal with the so-called medical experiment or measles epidemic and so forth. I'm not an epidemiologist, a public health expert, or whatever. I just don't feel competent to try to deal with that. So that particular thing I avoided completely in my book. The memo was supposed to be confidential. It wasn't marked as such, but it was sent to, and it was invited by Barbara Johnston of the Committee for Human Rights. And it was sent to top AAA officials. And in a meeting in around 2010 at the AAA, I was in the session audience. 2 anthropologists admitted leaking it into cyberspace. And in my book, I mentioned that Napoleon Chagnon himself circulated it in cyberspace, and so did Bill Irons and various others. So the memo is complicated as well.
Thanks
But
very
that,
much.
you
It
know,
is said that it was quite slanderous regarding Neil, who deserved far better treatment. And this article, I thought Susan Lindy would be on this Zoom, but isn't, talking about Neil's deep skepticism about modern culture. He drew on all the standards of scientific method to call into question the evolutionary benefits of science and technology.
I think that's really an exaggeration. I don't think we had that much of an impact with the memo. And again, the memo was intended to summarize Tierney's book, not make allegations ourselves. And it was leaked out into public. That was not our fault. Even if we had, what I think we should have done is simply picked up the phone and talked to officials personally and hoped that they weren't recording the conversation, and that way kept it quiet. But we had good intentions in alerting the AAA, and obviously the AAA eventually took it seriously, although ultimately how they dealt with it in various ways, including censorship of the final report, is problematic.
Thanks, Les and Herb. Bill Mitchell.
Thanks, Les. And by the way, I was aware at the time that you and Terry did not intend to write an email that keeps going around the world and around and around and around, that it was a private email. And it kind of gave me at the time, hey, before you send an email, think twice, right, before you press send, right? But I wanted to go back to Rick's first question and your response to it. I think one of the issues for me with Chagnon, actually with many anthropologists, is the epistemological issue of using a single descriptor to describe a whole society, right? You know, simply using fierce as a way of, it avoids context, it essentializes, and you know, completely obscures the reality, the underlying realities of how, you know, I might be fierce, but then I also might be loving, and I also might be, you know, a lot of it contextual, where we are, with whom we are, the underlying ecological issues, and so on. And that for me was the big problem with Shagnan's, sense of things.
Yeah, incidentally, somebody remarked that the memo had some points in it that were slanderous. Read Chagnon's memoir. You can find defamation of character, slander, etc., libel in his memoir. And likewise in some things that were said about his critics here and there as well, including in Borowski's book by some of Chagnon's defenders there and elsewhere. Some of this just gets out of control, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, I think that it's useful to keep in mind that I read Ken Good's book, and that brought up the whole controversy regarding the switch of Ken Good from Napoleon Chagnon as his advisor over to Marvin Harris, and there was, these are allegations, so I don't know if they're true or not, but Good had suggested that, had made some things that weren't really great about Chagnon. Of course, Marvin Harris has his own particular, interpersonal relationship issues as well. So, it's difficult for us to cast stones, but one of the things I liked about your talk today was how you really focused on the Yanomami, the situation of the Yanomami. And one of the things that I really liked was hearing, kind of like rethinking the Yanomami as a global phenomenon, because they have all of these books, articles, merchandise, etc., that's associated with them, so that they are truly a global brand in some ways, if you might want to call it that. But it reminds us that oftentimes we're forgetting about how they are as human beings, how they really relate among themselves, to each other, and how they survive within their particular environment. So I think that I really like hearing that, that perspective from you today.
There's more of that focus on Yanomami in the E-International Relations article. As I recall, I don't even mention Chagnon in that article. It's just about the Yanomami. And unfortunately, again, the controversy is still around here and there in various ways, but it detracts attention from the Yanomami. And I really had a good experience with them. And I really appreciate their willingness to allow me to live in their village, so forth, and help me. They were nice people.
Yeah. Jim Weil, you're muted, Jim. Jim, you're muted. Jim.
Sorry about that. I've been coughing because I've got COVID. Since we've been touching on the personalities, I've had this sense for a long time that anthropologists are attracted to do studies where it somehow reflects who they are. And I think I understand that's why I like to study in peasant societies, being insecure and vulnerable and tentative. But when brought up with Marvin Harris getting into it with Chagnon, these macho type personalities maybe look in the field for that kind of a situation, and then that's what they find. And so we've talked a lot about that, but I wish we just would say a little bit about coming out of cultural ecology. You mentioned Roy Rappaport, who tried to develop a more human ecology, which looked more at the environmental variables and the history, because the Yanomami are so fascinating in that I understand they're different from surrounding societies. They were great die-offs after the Spanish and Portuguese came. And they were a small group of people that moved from the backwaters down into the larger areas. and didn't even have the same root crops as their staples, but did plantains. How much can we understand the degree of violence and their personalities and all of that in relation to how they adapted not only to where they are now, but how they came to be there in the first place? Is that enough for another 2 hours, or can you say a little bit about it?
There's very little on the ethno-history of the Yanomami other than what's in Brian Ferguson's book. And there's almost no archaeology in the region. And so that's a kind of blank that needs to be researched. But there are more immediate problems. And I think one of them is land rights and health in terms of Yanomami's situation. Some of them are very remote and have not been impacted by the gold miners, but a lot of the population has been. Estimates vary, and some are as high as 80%. And they are dealing with that. And I mentioned in that international relations article a book on hope. And I forget the exact title at the moment, but that's a very important book to think about. And I think it's important to document instead of the history, although that's important, but more important to document the current situation of the Yanomami and how they're struggling and how they're adapting to that, including stories, accounts of individuals, individual communities, and so forth. It's the same thing all over the world in many different situations, Ukraine, Yemen, et cetera, where there needs to be documentation of the immediate crisis. And that's a lot easier said than done.
Thanks very
Well,
much.
I see that, with more and more crises that we get drawn into the present moment, and anthropology has come along trying to give a sense of where we came from as humanity, and even talking about human nature and the capacity to be peaceful or violent. I hope we don't give up altogether to try to understand how things fit together in a society, how it functions on its own terms, and how it came to be what it was because of the present emergencies, which seem to be worse and worse all the time.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I think anthropology has its problems, but I think it's also contributed a lot. And it's hard to really measure that, to document, to quantify that. But we've had millions of students. What has been the impact of that, for better or for worse? And I think in many cases for better. And obviously, in a lot of these conflicts, there's a lack of understanding of the other side and respect, appreciation, and honoring their rights and so forth. And anthropology could contribute towards that. I think anthropology could do a lot more in terms of the State Department and diplomacy and so on, and informing people in Congress, etc. The circus there.
I might say that the darkness in El Dorado, Tierney's book, and the controversies that are being discussed here, Leslie, you shared how it's influenced so many different ways. But I bet each and every one of us has some kind of a personal reaction to when those things were happening. And so I just thought I would say, since you mentioned the AAA, I was on the executive board of the AAA at the time Tierney's book came out, and I was in the professional practicing seat, and I would say that it was a challenge for an organization to respond in such a dramatic kind of insult, threat to anthropology as a profession, that it consumed a lot of our time as a board. And so I just thought I'd say that. So
yeah, and I think a lot of people made a very honest, sincere, decent effort at dealing with this dilemma. But there were a lot of others, not necessarily on the executive board, certainly, that did almost the opposite.
Thank you. Thank you.
I can see that Tim is trying to end this thing very, very badly. So Les, thank you so much. I just wanted to second what you had to say about the need for more anthropologists to be doing advising to the State Department and elsewhere in our government.
Yep.
That is the way those people who work in those areas have been received by our discipline and treated as almost as enemies, as complicit with the bad things that get ascribed to the U.S. So I think that's sort of a disciplinary problem as well, not just something for us to desire.
Subject for another session at the AAA or another book.
Yes, probably.
I think one of the nice things about our chats is the depth of experience that the speakers usually have, and certainly the members of the audience do. So it's Les, it's wonderful to hear about, with your decades of experience and involvement with the Yanomami, and I'm also I really wish we could hear more about your work in Thailand, but that would be for another talk, and I'd be fascinated, especially about your take on spiritual ecology and things like that. So I'd love to hear that.
I'd love to talk about spiritual ecology. It's very positive. Yeah.
Yes. So I think that we've been at it for a while now. And so I think that it's time for all of us to say, see you later, Les, and thank you. And a little, kind of round of applause for Les. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much for
Aloha.
being here and taking the time to share your knowledge, your decades of experience with us on this topic. And if you'd like to join our listserv, let me know and I'll add you, because I think we have a lot of interesting things to share with each other. And once again, thanks so much. Thank you, all of you, for being here and being with us today. Thanks a lot. So
Thank
we'll
you.
see you
Thank you.
in our next talk will be in December. So we'll see you in early December. Okay, so we'll talk to you then. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Les.
Thank you.